From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out. What a crowd. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that at a noontime event on an unseasonably warm day in January in Washington, D.C., we get more than a standing room only crowd, a crowded crowd. My name is Rob Casper. I'm the head of the Poetry and Literature Center here at the Library of Congress, and I want to welcome you here today for this afternoon's program. The first in the Poetry and Literature Center's calendar for 2013. First of all, I need to ask you to turn off your cell phones and all of the electronic devices you might have that can interfere with our recording equipment. And I also want to let you know that this program is being recorded both by the Library of Congress and by Fox News. And by participating, you give us permission, and you give Fox News permission for future use of this recording. The Poetry and Literature Center, which is the home to the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, has presented programs such as this one for 75 years. We are celebrating this great anniversary with a packed season of readings, panels, and lectures. As you walk out today, if it's not too crazy, please visit our table right outside the door and sign up for our email notifications. I know many of you already have, but if you haven't and you want to find out more about poetry and literature at the library, please sign it up. We also have some flyers with select events coming up and brochures. Can you hear me? Is that better? Sorry. Today's program with Poet Laureate Natasha Trethewey is special for a number of reasons. First, it marks the start of Natasha's historic residency at the library. She will work and receive visitors in the poetry room, which is just up in the attic of this building, until her term ends in May, a first for the laureateship. Today, she will set the stage for her months to come by addressing history, our country's, but also her own. Her focus is the Civil War, in conjunction with the library's exhibit, The Civil War in America, of which the New York Times states, it doesn't explicitly ask questions about means and ends, but we can't help thinking about them as the letters, diaries, documents, and images accumulate, end quote. Natasha's reading will follow such a course as she intersperses poems of her own on the war with poems by her predecessors. And one might argue today's program marks the natural progression of Natasha's work on the Civil War, work that began over a decade ago when she came to the Library of Congress to research the Louisiana Native Guard and ended up writing the title poem to her Pulitzer Prize-winning third collection. And actually, she wrote it in the main reading room, which I'm sure many of you have been to. Natasha will read for approximately a half hour, and then we will open up the floor to questions from you. Afterwards, we'll scoot Natasha out, and she'll move up to the second floor outside the Civil War in America exhibit for a book signing. I hope you will take that opportunity to visit or to revisit the exhibit and let what we are about to hear intermingle with the wealth of stories and images exhibition director Cheryl Reagan and her team at the library's Interpretive Programs Office has assembled. I should also say that when Natasha was here back in, I think, 2002? 2004, she looked at a facsimile of a book that was the basis of her title poem, Native Guard. Cheryl Reagan, who I just mentioned, is in the back corner over there behind this podium with not only that facsimile that Natasha used, but the original copy of the book. So it's worth checking out. And one of the many reasons the library is such an essential resource for the country. The aim of this program is to celebrate poetry's unique ability to reframe our past and examine how and why we see it as we do. And no one is more accomplished at this essential work than our newest poet laureate. I would also like to take this opportunity to publicly welcome Natasha to the Library of Congress. I have known her for many, many years, and she is one of the most committed, welcoming, and truly inspiring poets I have ever met. I feel honored to join the rest of the staff here at the library in supporting her laureateship, one which has already resonated across the country and clearly resonated with all of you, and one which will continue to promote the art in new and vital ways. So please join me in welcoming our 19th Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, Natasha Trethewey.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. It's a delight to be here, and I thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the Civil War in the poetry and prose of Walt Whitman and read a few of his poems and some of my own. Because of his open-armed enthusiasm, his inclusiveness and celebration of everyone, even the lowliest prostitute or degraded slave, Walt Whitman's work has come to represent a poetics of democracy, a humane tradition of anti-racism. And even now, there is much to be learned from him and from his conflicted relationship to his subject matter, especially as Americans near and far are still fighting ideologically the Civil War. A champion of American experience, the diversity of its people and their labors, Whitman feared that the real war would not get written. He believed that war existed in the alternative narrative that might be offered by so many anonymous soldiers, most dead and buried, often in unmarked graves, whose stories would never be told. Whitman's Specimen Days becomes a kind of monument to the common soldier, the harsh facts of war recorded in his honest language. And yet, there is little written of black soldiers, though he mentions tending to them as well. Among the black soldiers wounded or sick and in the contraband camps, I also took my way whenever in their neighborhood and did what I could for them. This is only a slight acknowledgement from the poet who wrote with such great inclusiveness of blacks in such poems as I Sing the Body Electric and Song of Myself. Perhaps a more telling poem, however, one that suggests the complexity of Whitman's conflicted relationship to the South and all her citizens, is Reconciliation. Reconciliation. Word all over, beautiful as the sky, beautiful that war and all its deeds of carnage must in time be utterly lost, that the hands of the sisters death and night incessantly, softly wash again and ever again the soiled world. For my enemy is dead, a man divine as myself is dead. I look where he lies, white-faced and still in the coffin. I draw near, bend down, and touch lightly with my lips the white face in the coffin. In this poem, Whitman suggests the reunion of the nation, men on opposite sides of the war drawn together beneath the banner of reconciliation. However, in the final image of the dead, white-faced in the coffin, Whitman leaves out the reality of so many dead soldiers whose faces were not white. And further, according to historian David Blight, the poem highlights in the kinship of the dead white brothers the ultimate betrayal of the dark-faced folk whom the dead had shared in liberating. This kind of erasure would continue to dominate Civil War memory as monuments to only part of the story inscribed a narrative on the American landscape, particularly in the South. The Lost War, then, is the narrative of Black Americans whose stories were often subjugated, lost, or left out of public memory and in the creation of public monuments. Just off the coast of my hometown, Gulfport, Mississippi, is a series of barrier islands, Cat, Horn, Deer, and Ship Island, that separate the dirty waters of the coastal area with its dead fish and debris from the clearer waters out in the Gulf. Ship Island is a Civil War site, and during the warmer months, anyone can buy passage on one of the small cruisers making the daily trips out there and take a brief tour offered by the National Park Service. The island's history is an interesting one. The first regiments of the Louisiana Native Guards were mustered into service in September, October, and November of 1862. The first regiment thus becoming the first officially sanctioned regiment of black soldiers in the Union Army, and the second and third made up of men who had been slaves only months before enlisting. During the war, the fort at Ship Island, Mississippi, called Fort Massachusetts, was maintained as a prison for Confederate soldiers, military convicts, and prisoners of war, manned by the 2nd Regiment. In his wartime remembrances, Whitman pointed out that few white regiments made a better appearance on parade than the 1st and 2nd Louisiana Native Guards. He'd seen them on parade in Louisiana. And yet, only a few years ago, visitors to the fort would learn almost none of the history. Instead, they'd see first the plaque placed at the entrance by the Daughters of the Confederacy, listing the names of the Confederate men once interred there. Nowhere a similar plaque memorializing the names of the Native Guards. And if tourists didn't know to ask about the history of the black soldiers, most likely the park ranger overlooked this aspect of the fort's history in his tour, mentioning only that this was a fort taken over by Union forces and that Confederate prisoners were kept there. This omission serves to further the narrative that blacks were passive recipients of the freedom bestowed upon them by white brothers who fought and died in the Civil War. In February 2005, in the Vicksburg National Military Park, a monument to these black soldiers was finally erected, though not without certain omissions. According to the Jackson Advocate, during the earlier groundbreaking ceremony, Park Superintendent Bill Nichols and Park Historian Terry Winchell begrudgingly labeled the black regiments as supply guards in the text on display, rather than giving the men their full measure of respect as the fully recognized infantry, artillery, and cavalry units that they were. That a more inclusive history of black soldiers is not given on Ship Island or in the Vicksburg Military Park, and that certain facts are often left out of the historical narratives and perhaps until most recently were likely to be given only the smallest part in larger histories, is emblematic of the ideological contests about how to remember the Civil War, how we construct public memory with its omissions and embellishments. As David Blight asserts in Race and Reunion, the Civil War in American Memory, deflections and evasions, careful remembering and necessary forgetting, and embittered and irreconcilable versions of experience are all the stuff of historical memory. Though Whitman had acknowledged black soldiers in his letters and reminiscences, ultimately he often left blacks out of his larger concerns. When the South is spoken of, he wrote, contrasting the roles of the ruling class and the masses, no one means the people, the mass of free men. Here, Whitman is referring to the free white masses, even as his language reminds us of the invisible freed men all around the South. In fact, according to Daniel Aaron in The Unwritten War, the Negro did not figure significantly in his calculations of America's future, the grand plan of history, and it is just as mistaken to confuse Whitman's prose opinion of the Negro and the poetic use he made of him in Leaves of Grass as it is to identify his anti-slavery position with abolitionism. At the groundbreaking ceremony to the new monument, historian Jim Woodrich's words seem to echo Whitman's more than a century-old prediction that the real war would not get into the books. By being here today, Woodrich began, we acknowledge the valor and honor of the black Union troops. Their story, he said, yearns to be known. William Faulkner has said the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. All around us, debates about the memory of the Civil War and its aftermath continue to shape contemporary concerns. These issues are ultimately fights about remembrance, how we see ourselves as Americans within the context of history. When the Daughters of the Confederacy mounted the plaque at Ship Island, they were working to inscribe their exclusive version of history onto the public memory, leaving out the other population on the island. C. Van Woodward, in his preface to Jumping Jim Crow, Southern Politics from Civil War to Civil Rights, asserts that during the last 2 centuries of the 19th century, the last 2 decades of the 19th century, it was the first who were white ladies who bore the primary responsibility for the myths glorifying the old order, the lost cause, and white supremacy. Woodward is referring specifically to the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Daughters of the American Revolution, Daughters of Pilgrims, and Daughters of Colonial Governors. They were considered guardians of the past. Non-daughters, he writes, were excluded. The efforts of the Daughters of the Confederacy extended beyond the erecting of monuments and the naming of roads. Indeed, they commissioned the history textbooks written for Southern schools and oversaw the material contained within them in order to control the narrative of the South's role in the war. That is, to tell a story that was rife with omissions and embellishments, that sought to cast the causes of the war only in terms of states' rights and not at all in the matter of slavery. It would seem that Whitman, in his conflicted attitudes toward the roles of both North and South, toward slavery and black suffrage, he hated slavery but did not believe blacks capable of exercising the vote, could foresee such one-sided narratives and the need for a fuller understanding of the roots of the conflict, a history more inclusive than what would be told and written for several generations. Whitman knew all too well that the real war he feared would not get written was not a pleasant one. Referring primarily to the seething hell and black infernal background of countless minor scenes, he nonetheless foreshadows another backdrop, the narrative of blacks relegated to the margins of public memory. Long, long hence, he anticipated, when the grave has quenched many hot prejudices and vitalities, and an entirely new class of thinkers and writers come to the argument, the complete question can perhaps be fairly weighed. When Whitman took on the task of setting down on paper some of his thoughts about the Civil War, its causes and its aftermath, he probably did not have the image of the black soldier in the foreground of his thinking. Though his wartime reminiscences would consider regiments of black troops, his poem, Ethiopia Saluting the Colors, focuses on a dusky woman so ancient, hardly human, and not black soldiers who were participants in the war rather than bystanders. Ethiopia Saluting the Colors. Who are you, dusky woman, so ancient, hardly human, with your woolly white and turbaned head and bare, bony feet? Why, rising by the roadside here, do you the colors greet? 'Tis while our army lines Carolina's sand and pines, forth from thy hovel, thou, Ethiopia, comest to me, as under doughty Sherman I march toward the sea. Me master 100 years since from my parents sundered a little child, they caught me as the savage beast is caught, then hither me across the sea the cruel slaver brought. No further does she say, but lingering all the day, her high-born turbaned head she wags and rolls her darkling eye, and curtsies to the regiments, the giddens moving by. What is it, faithful woman, so blear, hardly human? Why wag your head with turban bound, yellow, red, and green? Are the things so strange and marvelous you see or have seen? The omissions inherent even in his later writings about the war underscore the questions of historical memory with which future generations would contend. Probably no future age can know, but I well know how the gist of this fiercest and most resolute of the world's warlike contentions resided exclusively in the unnamed, unknown rank and file, and how the brunt of its labor of death was, to all essential purposes, volunteered. Here, Whitman directs us to the unnamed, unknown rank-and-file white soldier, and inadvertently to black soldiers as well, the legions of runaway slaves and freedmen who flocked to Union camps first as contraband and then later as men and women eager to enlist, whose story has been left out of public memory of the Civil War and has only begun to be inscribed into the man-made, monumental American landscape. In positioning myself as a Native daughter, a Native guardian of Mississippi's past, I've sought to tell a fuller version of our shared history, filling in the opening that Walt Whitman made for that entirely new generation of thinkers and writers. When I was growing up in Mississippi, I would go out every 4th of July with my grandmother to the fort on Ship Island and take the tour of the fort, never learning anything about that history when I was a child. So coming to the library was a wonderful experience to find those documents that I could look at right there. Civil War soldiers writing letters from Ship Island, also the image which is on the cover of this book that represents a page from the diary of the colonel who was stationed there that I got to actually look at. When you look at it close up, what you can see is that because of the shortage of paper, the Union colonel who confiscated it from a Confederate's home had to cross-write over what was already written inside the journal. So what you have is the words going one way across the page and then turn and go the other way. And it becomes this perfect metaphor for the intersections of North and South, black and white, slave and free. In order to write the poems, one of the first things I had to do was take a pilgrimage back to my Mississippi. Pilgrimage, Vicksburg, Mississippi. Here the Mississippi carved its mud-dark path, a graveyard for skeletons of sunken riverboats. Here the river changed its course, turning away from the city as one turns, forgetting from the past. The abandoned bluffs, land sloping up above the river's bend, where now the Yazoo fills the Mississippi's empty bed. Here, the dead stand up in stone, white marble on Confederate Avenue. I stand on ground once hollowed by a web of caves. They must have seemed like catacombs in 1863 to the woman sitting in her parlor, candle lit, underground. I can see her listening to shells explode, writing herself into history, asking what is to become of all the living things in this place. This whole city is a grave. Every spring, pilgrimage, the living come to mingle with the dead, brush against their cold shoulders in the long hallways, listen all night to their silence and indifference, relive their dying on the green battlefield. At the museum, we marvel at their clothes, preserved under glass, so much smaller than our own, as if those who wore them were only children. We sleep in their beds, the old mansions hunkered on the bluffs, draped in flowers, funereal, a blur of petals against the river's gray. The brochure in my room calls this living history. The brass plate on the door reads, Prissy's room. A window frames the river's crawl toward the Gulf. In my dream, the ghost of history lies down beside me, rolls over, pins me beneath a heavy arm. Thank you. So I'm going to read now the title poem of the book, Native Guard, which is the poem that I worked on so many years ago here at the library and in the reading room. This poem takes as a starting point a black soldier who would have been a freed slave, someone who had been owned previously by Major Dumas. Major Dumas was an officer in the 2nd Regiment of the Union Army, the Louisiana Native Guards, who, when he was born himself octoroon or quadroon, he was the son of a white planter father and a mulatto mother. And inherited his father's slaves when he was a young man. Because it was illegal to manumit slaves in Louisiana, he did not do that, even though he didn't like having slaves. But when the Union began to recruit black soldiers, he freed his slaves and encouraged his men to join as well. The battles that I mention in the poem are also actual skirmishes. The poem has an epigraph from Frederick Douglass that reads, "If this war is to be forgotten, I ask in the name of all things sacred, what shall men remember?" Native Guard, November 1862. Truth be told, I do not want to forget anything of my former life, the landscape song of bondage, dirge in the river's throat where it churns into the gulf, wind in trees choked with vines. I thought to carry with me want of freedom, though I had been freed, remembrance, not constant recollection. Yes, I was born a slave at harvest time in the parish of Ascension. I've reached 33 with history of one younger inscribed upon my back. I now use ink to keep record, a closed book, not the lure of memory, flawed, changeful, that dulls the lash for the master, sharpens it for the slave. December 1862. For the slave, having a master sharpens the bend into work, the way the sergeant moves us now to perfect battalion drill, dress parade. Still, we're called supply units, not infantry, and so we dig trenches, haul burdens for the army no less heavy than before. I heard the colonel call it nigger work. Half rations make our work familiar still. We take those things we need from the Confederates' abandoned homes, salt, sugar, even this journal, near full with someone else's words, overlapped now, cross-hatched beneath mine, on every page, his story intersecting with my own. January 1863. Oh, how history intersects, my own birth upon a ship called the Northern Star, and I'm delivered into a new life. Fort Massachusetts, a great irony, both path and destination of freedom I'd not dared to travel. Here, now, I walk ankle deep in sand, fly bitten, nearly smothered by heat, and yet I can look out upon the gulf and see the surf breaking, tossing the ships, the great gunboats bobbing on the water. And are we not the same, slaves in the hands of the master, destiny, night sky red with the promise of fortune, dawn pink as new flesh, healing, unfettered. January 1863. Today, dawn read as warning, unfettered supplies stacked on the beach at our landing, washed away in the storm that rose too fast, caught us unprepared. Later, as we worked, I joined in the low singing someone raised to pace us and felt a bond in labor I had not known. It was then a dark man removed his shirt, revealed the scars cross-hatched like the lines in this journal on his back. It was he who remarked at how the ropes cracked like whips on the sand, made us take note of the wild dance of a tent loosed by wind. We watched and learned. Like any shrewd master, we know now to tie down what we will keep. February 1863. We know it is our duty now to keep white men as prisoners, rebel soldiers, would-be masters. We're all bondsmen here, each to the other. Freedom has gotten them captivity, for us a conscription we have chosen, jailers to those who still would have us slaves. They are cautious, dreading the sight of us. Some neither read nor write, are laid too low and have few words to send, but those I give them. Still, they are wary of a Negro writing, taking down letters. X binds them to the page, a mute symbol like the cross on a grave. I suspect they fear I'll listen, put something else down in ink. March 1863. I listen, put down in ink what I know they labor to say between silences too big for words. Worry for beloveds, my dearest, how are you getting along? What has become of their small plots of land? Did you harvest enough food to put by? They long for the comfort of former lives. I see you as you were, waving goodbye. Some send photographs, a likeness in case the body can't return. Others dictate harsh facts of this war. The hot air carries the stench of limbs, rotten in the bone pit. Flies swarm, a black cloud. We hunger, grow weak. When men die, we eat their share of hardtack. April 1863. When men die, we eat their share of hardtack, trying not to recall their hollow sockets, the worm stitch of their cheeks. Today we buried the last of our dead from Pascagoula and those who died retreating to our ship, white sailors in blue firing upon us as if we were the enemy. I'd thought the fighting over, then watched a man fall beside me, knees first as in prayer, then another, his arms outstretched as if borne upon the cross. Smoke that rose from each gun seemed a soul departing. The colonel said, an unfortunate incident, said, their name shall deck the page of history. June 1863. Some name shall deck the page of history as it is written on stone. Some will not. Yesterday, word came of colored troops dead on the battlefield at Port Hudson, how General Banks was heard to say, I have no dead there, and left them unclaimed. Last night, I dreamt their eyes still open, dim, clouded as the eyes of fish washed ashore, yet fixed, staring back at me. Still more come today, eager to enlist. Their bodies, haggard faces, gaunt limbs bring news of the mainland. Starved, they suffer like our prisoners. Dying, they plead for what we do not have to give. Death makes equals of us all, a fair master. August 1864. Dumas was a fair master to us all. He taught me to read and write. I was a man's servant, if not a man. At my work, I studied natural things, all manner of plants, birds I draw now in my book, wren, willet, egret, loon. Tending the gardens, I thought only to study live things, thought never to know so much about the dead. Now I tend Ship Island graves, mounds like dunes that shift and disappear. I record names, send home simple notes, not much more than how and when, an official duty. I'm told it's best to spare most detail, but I know there are things which must be accounted for. 1865. These are things which must be accounted for. Slaughter under the white flag of surrender, black massacre at Fort Pillow, our new name, the Corps d'Afrique, words that take the native from our claim, mossbacks and freedmen, exiles in their own homeland, the disease, the maimed, every lost limb and what remains, phantom ache, memory haunting an empty sleeve, the hog eaten at Gettysburg, unmarked in their graves, all the dead letters unanswered, untold stories of those that time will render mute. Beneath battlefields, green again, the dead molder, a scaffolding of bone we tread upon, forgetting, truth be told. I'm going to finish up with two short poems now, and then we can open up the floor for questions. This is a poem after a well-known painting by Winslow Homer, Veteran in a New Field. Perhaps many of you have seen it. When I think about looking at a painting like that one and deciding to write a poem about it, it still is for me about thinking about that opening that Walt Whitman makes for us to insert the histories that have been lesser known or forgotten. In looking at Veteran in a New Field, I think of other veterans and their fields. There's an epigraph that reads, "The dead, they lay along the lines like sheaves of wheat. I could have walked on the bodies almost from one end to the other." Again, the fields. No more muskets, the bone-drag weariness of marching, the trampled grass, soaked earth red as the wine of sacrament. Now the veteran turns toward a new field, bright as domes of the Republic. Here he has shrugged off the past, his jacket and canteen flung down in the corner. At the center of the painting, he anchors the Trinity, joining earth and sky. The wheat falls beneath his scythe, a language of bounty, the swaths like scripture on the field's open page. Boundless, the wheat stretches beyond the frame, as if toward a distant field, the white canvas where sky and cotton meet, where another veteran toils, his hands the color of dark soil. Thank you. And this last poem has an epigraph from a famous poem by a former poet laureate, consultant in poetry, Allen Tate, another Southerner. This is from his poem, Ode to the Confederate Dead. Now that the salt of their blood stiffens the saltier oblivion of the sea. Elegy for the Native Guards. We leave Gulfport at noon, gulls overhead trailing the boat, streamers, noisy fanfare all the way to Ship Island. What we see first is the fort, its roof of grass a lee, half reminder of the men who served there, a weathered monument to some of the dead. Inside we follow the ranger, hurried though we are to get to the beach. He tells of graves lost in the Gulf, the island split in half when Hurricane Camille hit, shows us casemates, cannons, the store that sells souvenirs, tokens of history long buried. The Daughters of the Confederacy has placed a plaque here at the fort's entrance, each Confederate soldier's name raised hard in bronze, no names carved for the Native Guards, 2nd Regiment, Union men, black phalanx. What is monument to their legacy? All the grave markers, all the crude headstones, water lost. Now fish dart among their bones, and we listen for what the waves intone. Only the fort remains, near 40 feet high, round, unfinished, half open to the sky, the elements, wind, rain, God's deliberate eye. Thank you.
So great thanks to Natasha. And now we'll have questions from the audience. We have a staffer here who has a microphone. Make sure you wait until she comes along to give you the microphone so you can be recorded for the future. Here you go. Over here.
Hi, I'm Karen Allen here, and I welcome you to Washington. Very excited about your residency.
Thank you.
And how serious you're taking the position. I'd like to know if you could give us the top 3 things that you would like to accomplish as the laureate.
The top 3 things that I'd like to accomplish as the laureate: bring poetry to a wider audience, bring poetry to a wider audience, bring poetry to a wider audience. Now, if we went further, there'd be some more, but I'm going to stick with those as the top three.
To paraphrase my granddaughter, it's so cool to be in this room, listening to you and seeing you. I enjoyed your interview with Diane Reeves.
Me too.
And especially the part where you just on the idea that, the rumors of portrait demise. And then I recall that I wanted, when I was a kid, to be a poet, and then I became a lawyer. But I would like to ask you if you could kindly read Help from Native Art, which you read on that radio show, and it was touching me deeply.
Well, actually, Help is from Thrall.
Yes, Thrall.
I'd be happy to read it if someone had Thrall in the audience by any chance. Do you have it? I was gonna. I thought, if I had to try to recite it, I probably could. But I like to have the. I like to. Okay. I like to have the words in front of me. Thank you. Well, this is also an ekphrastic poem. It's one based on a photograph by Robert Frank from his series, The Americans. Help, 1968. When I see Frank's photograph of a white infant in the dark arms of a woman who must be the maid, I think of my mother and the year we spent alone, my father at sea. The woman stands in profile, back against a wall, holding her charge, their faces side by side, the look on the child's face strangely prescient, a tiny furrow in the space between her brows. Neither of them looks toward the camera, nor do they look at each other. That year, when my mother took me for walks, she was mistaken again and again for my maid. Years later, she told me she'd say I was her daughter, and each time strangers would stare in disbelief, then empty the change from their pockets. Now I think of the betrayals of flesh, how she must have tried to make of her face an inscrutable mask and hold it there as they made their small offerings, pressing coins into my hands. How, like the woman in the photograph, she must have seemed, carrying me each day, white in her arms, as if she were a prop, a black backdrop, the dark foil in this American story.
Thank you.
Would you describe, as you have traveled around the country, the response that you received to your sense and sensitivity to this history in North and South, and any distinction between the two regions and response?
Did you all hear the question? He's asking about, in my travels around the country, what sense do I get of people's response, their sense and sensitivity toward some of the history that I'm trying to work with in my poems, and whether or not there are any differences north and south. Did I get it all? You know what? I actually find a lot more sensitivity than I might have imagined. Because when I was working on both of these books, the book I read from Native Guard and also the most recent collection, Thrall, I knew that I was dealing with difficult history, a history that, of course, is very much woven into the thread of who we are as Americans, and yet material that is still difficult for us to talk about sometimes. And what I have found is not only, to go back to the previous question, not only do people come to poetry readings and listen very thoughtfully and participate in Q&As after the readings, suggesting that poetry is not dead, but also in the comments that I get from people afterwards when I have a chance to talk with them, people do seem to be moved. They do seem to want to have the conversation. And I think it's because this is what poetry can do for us in ways that our ordinary conversation between each other can't quite do. It is that elegant and memorable language of poetry that touches not only the heart but also the intellect and makes for us a safe place to deal with what is both traumatic and difficult and seemingly divisive in a way that brings us all in under that, the umbrella or that elegant envelope of form that a poem is.
Hi, congratulations again on your laureateship. And
Thank you.
my question actually is about classes, since you mentioned it in response to reading the poem called. You said the three things, or the one main of the three things, is to bring poetry to a wider audience. And I know with both Native Art, Civilian for All, and even in domestic work, you did so much with both photography and now recently with painting. Could you talk about your relationship to the image, or specifically to visual art? And is part of that about broadening the audience with poetry, like going to another medium, or is it just something that you're specifically drawn to in dealing with the visual art?
Well, I think I'm drawn first to the image because it really is how memory works, particularly in the visual memories that we have. And so even as a child, I began trying to record everything that I wanted to hold on to visually in memory. I would make photographs in my head of every room in my grandmother's house because I wanted to keep it with me and be able to recall all of it. So that was some early practice with working with imagery. Imagery is also the thing that we have that is useful for helping someone else to see things as we see them, to present a vision of the world as specifically as possible in the image, the imagery of a poem. And for me, writing about photographs and also writing about paintings is a way to begin with that given image. And I like to begin with the given image not only because it is a way of seeing and conveying to others what I see, but also the images that we are given in the frames of paintings or in the frames of a photograph also suggest so much possibility for what's not being seen. I'm always interested in what it is we can't see, what's just outside the frame of a photograph, what happened just before or after, and the way that when we read photographs, there is always that kind of sort of pang of nostalgia, the way that we can know so much about the lives of the people in them that they couldn't have known at that particular historical moment. So it is a way also of entering into history for me.
As we enter this digital age, what do you see, or how do you see it affecting the future of poetry compared to days gone by?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's exciting because there's the possibility of poetry reaching so many more people through yet another medium. For example, at Emory University, where I'm on the faculty, we have an online journal called Southern Spaces, and there are many other online journals that have come up in the last few years. But this is a journal in which we publish a segment called Poets in Place, and we follow poets to their geographical locations, the regions of the country or other places they write about, videotaping them as they talk about the place, reading their own poems. And we put these little video documentaries up on the web, as well as the text of the poems appear. And we know that we get hits all around the world now. So people who might not have seen these poets before are getting some exposure to them because of digital media. I also know that the Academy of American Poets sends out little poetry sort of broadcasts over text messages. So people who are subscribed will receive a poem a day to wake up and start the day with. Again, something that we might not have been able to do before unless we, had a moment to pick up a book and read it before we left the house. But, even on the train, you probably have your phone with you, your smartphone, and you can read that poem that's been sent to you. I think it's exciting. I think anything that helps us have more access to poems is pretty good.
Hi.
Hello.
You mentioned that this invisible war continues. How do you think that war is manifested itself today between ideas and perceptions?
Well, one of the ways that I see it manifest is that the contentions over the Confederate flag, for example, and these are contentions that have happened in sort of both of the states that I've lived in, my native state, Mississippi, but also the state of Georgia. So, for example, the state of Georgia went through a battle in the last 10 years or so about part of the population wanting to change the flag that we have from the original Georgia flag that had the Confederate symbol on it. And when you read the newspapers about the debates surrounding the flag, one of the interesting things that comes up is that people aren't quite sure about the history. Many people don't actually know that the flag that we had in Georgia, that we did vote to get rid of not too long ago, was not the original Confederate flag that we had, I think back in 1896 or something like that, around the turn of the century. The flag that we had all this time with the Confederate symbol on it is a flag adopted in 1955 or so, just after the Brown v. Board of Education decision. So indeed, it was a flag that was a response to something that happened that some of the population weren't happy about. But there are people right now who don't know that that wasn't the original flag, and that indeed it did have something to do with contests over race and social justice. That's just one of the places that I do think we see these conversations and the contentions about the memory of the Civil War and what certain symbols have meant ongoing. Yeah. So one more question, perhaps?
Would you comment, please, and welcome again? Could you comment on your personal ambitions as a poet for the next year or 10 years or the rest of your career?
That sounds like a hard question, but it's a lot easier than it sounds. The biggest ambition that I have as a poet, personally, is to write a better poem than the last poem I wrote. So it's an easy answer, but it's a hard thing to do. I'll try, though. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.